My name is Mike Loftin, and would like to welcome you to our short interview series on housing and community development with housing and community development experts. I'm the CEO of HomeWise in New Mexico and a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. We're spending a lot of time talking about homeownership and the importance of closing the racial wealth gap and helping people access affordable housing. And one of the experts in this field and housing in general is Chris Herbert, the managing director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. So he's done a lot of research, been around the block, done a lot of things. This is going to be a great interview. So welcome, Chris.
Hey, Mike. Great to be with you.
Good. So Chris, I want to start with it's widely recognized that the home ownership gap largely drives the racial wealth gap. Maybe you could just kick us off by telling us about why the home ownership is so important to wealth building.
Sure. Home ownership builds wealth in three different ways, and maybe four different ways. The fourth way I would add is that it starts building wealth by the fact that people need a down payment to get into a home, and it becomes an important motivation for people to actually ramp up their savings to be able to put that down on a home. That's their first nest egg. Then they get the appreciation of their home over time, and that's leverage, right? So if I put $5,000 down on a $200,000 home, I get a return, not just on my $5,000, but I get it on the whole $200,000 home. So it's a leverage return. And then beyond that, I'm also paying down my mortgage over time, which is really important because, you can argue about whether or not homeownership is going to build wealth. Depends on where you live. And if you live in markets where housing has been going through the roof, then obviously there's a lot of appreciation potential. But many places have seen very little or real home appreciation over time. But even in those places, as you pay down your mortgage, you're going to build wealth. And the last, and I think often overlooked way in which housing helps build wealth is that, if you get a fixed rate mortgage, your mortgage payment's fixed. And over time, it's going to fall in real terms and become a smaller share of your income, meaning you have more income to devote to other things like savings. And then ultimately you pay off that mortgage and you live mortgage free. And particularly for folks later in life, that's an important source of kind of income and savings too. So you've got appreciation, paying down your mortgage, you've got that living rent free. All those things or at a lower cost add to wealth.
Yeah, no, it's such a powerful tool, and I know this from my own experience of growing up. That like you're eventually people pay off their mortgage, and now all they have is taxes and insurance to worry about. And this was I wrote a paper called "Home Ownership is Affordable Housing." I call that the Big Bang of affordability. Because it is my mom's experience was, she was a secretary and didn't make a lot of money, and she started saving in earnest for retirement when she paid off the mortgage because she had all this extra disposable income, and it was her path to financial security was largely driven by the fact that she bought a home in the 60s.
Right. The other piece of this that's really important is that there's a certain way in which this gets built into what you're doing every month. When you're paying off your mortgage, you're putting aside money. There's a bunch of studies academics have done trying to compare the benefits of owning relative to renting. And a lot of those studies, when they do theoretical comparisons, they're saying, we'll take Mike and say Mike saved up this money and he either put it into a mutual fund account or he bought a home, and let's see how he does over time. One of the assumptions is that not only you save that money up front, you put it away, you don't touch it, but also that every month, that difference between what your rent would be and this lower mortgage payment, you put aside. And theoretically, renters can do quite well. But the difference between theoretical and actual is the forced payment, the forced mechanism of that, both generating that initial savings and making that mortgage payment over time, that people just don't tend to have that discipline, but that owning a home kind of creates that natural discipline. So that's a part of the secret sauce too.
Well, and I remember Robert Shiller, the economist, the Shiller Price Index guy, wrote a piece once that was picked up by the Washington Post by Catherine Rammel on how, if you have $200,000 to put in the stock market versus buying a house, you're way better off putting in the stock market. And like the obvious point that got missed is, but you know what? Who has $200,000? Robert Shiller may.
Right.
Who I guess lives in a home that he owns, but you don't have $200,000. To your earlier point, it's this leveraged depreciation. You have $5,000 to put in a down payment. You're leveraging a $200,000 investment, and you're not really deciding where to put this extra money renting versus or stock market versus buying a home.
Right.
It's really a trade-off. Am I going to put it on rent because I have to have a place to live? I
Right.
have that expense no matter what. So why don't I put it in a house that also has dual characteristics? It's a consumptive spend because I need
Right.
consuming housing, but it's also an investment spend, right? It's also buying an
Right.
asset. And to your point, this automatic savings, even if there's zero appreciation,
Right. Even
every
there's
month,
no
that principal payment is going into my bank account.
Right. Mike, the other way these arguments come up is to say, having all your investment in this one asset is concentrating risk, and shouldn't we be, having other ways for people to build wealth? And in my view, it's not an either or. Yes, we ought to be creating other ways for people to create wealth. Yes, we ought to have retirement savings accounts where right now the tax benefits are skewed towards higher income people because it's based on your marginal tax rate, how much benefit you get. So we ought to be doing all kinds of things to help people create other forms of saving. But that doesn't take away from the fact that home ownership is still a really valuable way to do that. And we ought to be encouraging and supporting that too.
Right. No, definitely. So so lots of people, we get why home ownership matters. And instinctively, most Americans get it. Most Americans want to buy a home by far.
Right.
So what are the factors that are in the way? Why can't more people buy a home?
Well, certainly, cost is a big one. And particularly now, after coming out of the pandemic and the house price increases we saw that were just through the roof. One of the measures we look at in terms of affordability is what's the ratio between a median priced home and the median income in an area. And back 20 years ago in the 1990s, 30 years ago, pretty much most parts of the country, aside from, say, California, that ratio was 3. You needed about 3 times income to buy a median priced home. Now, nationally, it's pushing 5, and in markets in California, it's 8 or 9, and places like Denver has even gotten to be really quite high. So what that means is that people need to have both higher incomes to qualify for that mortgage, but importantly, a lot of cash to come to the closing table. We did an assessment, median priced home, just assuming a 3% down payment. In a lot of parts of the country, you need $20,000-$25,000 cash to close, and that's way beyond what most renters have. So the affordability, both in terms of them qualifying for a mortgage payment and coming up with that cash, are both pretty big barriers.
Right. So what should policymakers be thinking about? What should they consider to increase access to homeownership?
Well, I think in particular, thinking about, as I think about increasing homeownership, one of the important factors is racial disparities. The difference between Black and white homeownership rates and Black and Hispanic homeownership rates are enormous. They're 29 percentage points for Blacks and 24 percentage points for Hispanics. It's a huge difference in opportunities to have stable, secure housing that builds wealth. And a big part of that is differences in wealth. Coming up with that down payment is really hard, particularly if your parents didn't own a home, because a lot of young people go to the bank of mom and dad to get help. Somewhere between a quarter or more of people get money from mom and dad to close. So I think one thing that government clearly needs to do is to think about creating down payment assistance program at a much greater scale with a much more cohesive nation than we have. There's a gazillion down payment assistance programs, but they're hard to find. They're small. They're idiosyncratic into who can qualify. It makes it harder for big lenders, the GSEs and the like, to know how to incorporate them into underwriting. So I think that's one big thing. And then obviously, I think we need to really lean into making sure that mortgage underwriting is expansive in the sense of taking into account people's different histories and the like, so that we don't have rigid rules of credit underwriting that make it hard for people who would be good risks. And that's important that they would be good risks, but by traditional measures are left out. So, we've got to make sure we lean into making credit available generally to people who might not have perfect credit histories, get that down payment assistance. And then the last thing I would say is, there's definitely an information gap, in particular for people who don't have a family history of home ownership, to know what it takes to qualify, to know what it takes to search, to make a good choice, and to make sure we have adequate support for getting people to get that trusted third-party advice to guide them through the process, find a good mortgage, and get that cash they need, and then they'll be able to buy a home.
Yeah. Well, this down payment thing is very interesting to me, because it seems like that's not a difficult problem to solve, right? It's a money problem, but it's not complicated. It's not like coming up with a vaccine for COVID. It's like that's a pretty complicated. You kind of need some geniuses on your team to do that.
Right.
but not this, not right. You like helping people with down payment assistance and what, and there was an effort. Congresswoman Maxine Waters did have a proposal for a robust national down payment assistance as part of the Build Back Better bill. It did pass, but like, what is in the way with that, right? So like we spend $39 billion a year on rent vouchers, and that's just gone up, right? We're increasing rent, and I'm for having rent vouchers, Section 8,
Right.
housing choice vouchers. And policy, we've been doing this for a long time. The federal government writes a check essentially every month to help cover somebody's rent. Why don't we write a check once to help people buy their own housing? What if we called it not down payment? What if we call it a home ownership voucher? Would that help make it like we're doing vouchers for rent? What is wrong with doing a voucher for helping people own their own home? And you don't need to do it every month. As long as that home buyer is successful, you're done.
I'm not sure. I'm not a political scientist. I'm an economist, so I may not have a great answer for that. I mean, I think the fact that Maxine Waters had that bill, President Biden and his when he ran for president, of that down payment assistance program was a part of what he ran on. So it was much more commonly put forth. I think there was so many things put forth as part of Build Back Better. There was part of the negotiations. It got further along than it had at any time. But I think there is a question about. How do you make sure the assistance goes to people who, but for that, couldn't buy a home? And and there's a lot of folks who do have access to the bank of mom and dad and the like who might not need it. And so I do think there are places in the world where if you make these things widely available, you can look at what happened, and it can just add to house prices. So I think that trying to find a way to make sure that it's targeted will both be better policy and also better politics. And there were some interesting ways to do that. I mean, I think given my interest in racial disparities in homeownership, you'd like to have a way to target it by race. There are these special purpose credit programs that are being talked about now that would let you do that. Still some question how far you can push the race. But there's been proposals targeting first generation home buyers, which would a way to emphasize folks who but for this might not be able to get it. So I think there's some advances made too in thinking about how do we target this so it both may reduce the budgetary impact, may reduce the impact on housing markets, but still get to the people who need it.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. It also feels very like, yep, those are complexities to implementing a really good down payment assistance program, but also not intimidating, right?
No, they're not that hard, there's a lot of people who criticize the mortgage interest deduction, and for good reason. But if you just took the money, we don't spend that much on. One of my pet peeves is people keep bringing it up, but after the 2017 Tax Act, there's not a lot of money going to the mortgage interest deduction anymore because of the change in the standard deduction and limits on state and local tax deductions. But if you had taken what had been $70 billion at one point and turned that into a targeted financial assistance for lower income folks up front to be able to get into home ownership, you could have spent that money much more wisely to really make a big impact. So there's some ways in which we need to also rethink how we're spending money to support home ownership to make better use of it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And your third point that you made too, there's the down payment issue, there's access to mortgage financing, and this last point is one that you made that like. There's an information gap, right? And there's a knowledge gap on how to do it, how to go buy a home. Your parents didn't buy a home. I don't even know if I can buy a home, right? I don't even think about it. It's not even on my radar. I think this is a very overlooked part of that. I think those 3 points are really spot on. Like if you got good at all three of those, we'd really start closing this gap. But the third one, you don't hear people talking about, right? It's like, we have this home ownership counseling or housing counseling through HUD. It's a very small program. I think It's a mess. I think it doesn't, I don't know if it has real good effects personally, but it's a different issue. But it's like, we have at different times in American history have built different kind of institutional infrastructure to solve tough problems. Like, so an example I'd give is when people understood the problem of food deserts, it's like, well, could we do something? And they created the CDFI fund, and Department of Treasury created this Healthy Food Finance Initiative that provided capital to CDFIs to get grocery stores in food deserts. And now you got dozens of CDFIs, non-traditional lenders, doing it all over the country. but we still expect Wells Fargo and Bank of America and stuff to figure out how to do a $60,000 mortgage in Cleveland, because homes are really affordable in Cleveland. But a loan officer doesn't want to do that loan. It's a percentage of the loan is how they make. They're not going to make a living doing that. But like a CDFI, an alternative delivery system, seems to me is essential. That is very targeted to people who have been left behind. Is what we need to be doing and solving real problems on the ground, right? That like who does the small dollar mortgage in Santa Fe? It's a high cost area. One of HomeWise's innovations is let's bifurcate the financing into two pieces, so that if the loan to value of the first mortgage is below 80%, we just got rid of mortgage insurance. And then we provide the capital for the rest of it, which helps you buy the home, not insure the bank. It's actually going to buy the home, which makes it more affordable.
Right.
But that's something that we innovated on because of our particular market. Cleveland would do something different. What they're going to do in Appalachia is different. What do you think of making an investment in building that kind of alternative infrastructure?
I think it sounds great, Mike. I think you've identified, particularly the small balance loan one. I live on the coast. You live in a high cost area. There's a lot of people in this policy discussion live in high cost areas, and you can forget about the fact that there's a lot of places in the country where housing is affordable, but it's still hard to get a loan. The other piece of it too, and a lot of times in those places, is the housing's not in great shape, and so you need to have loans that also support rehab. And then a third factor could be that, when you start talking about either, substantial rehab or new construction, that the market value of those homes can be less than the cost, or less than the cost of production. And so, I think we need to have solutions that address all those issues. There was another piece of legislation that got pretty widespread support called you may be familiar with the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, that would have provided a tax credit to close that gap between market value and the cost of development to spur that kind of investment in rehab in areas where it's needed. And so, and those are kind of programs that would be really best suited to having, like, as you described, CDFIs and other organizations close to the ground who understand those market conditions to do it. So we've got
and it's like, and I don't blame the big financial institutions on this. It's like having a big financial institution figuring out how to do a purchase rehab loan for the housing stock in Cleveland is like, they're big. They can't customize that way, but we need that. So it's to your earlier point, it's a both and too, right? We need big efficient financial institutions, and you also need local innovative things on the ground that come up with those solutions and can implement them. So even with the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, that money was available. You still need people on the ground implementing, right? You still need that. And I think sometimes I think in policy circles, we think that the main action is coming up with the idea and passing it. It's like, and the work is, and we've done the work. To me, it's the opposite. That's when the work begins. Now we got to do it, right?
Yeah. And I think to your point, I think one of the good things about the U.S. ecosystem now is we actually have a pretty good network of organizations operating in those spaces. There's holes in it, right? There's not every part of the country that's going to have CDFIs or CDCs, community-based organizations that can do this. But there's a fair number of them, and they're often starved for not just capital but also operating support. Because it's hard to make these operations work. So, I'd love to see both greater financial support and operating support to really build on what's a pretty good network now, but could be a whole lot better.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. We have the ingredients, right? We have to scale it, and So what do you see? What are the trends for the future here? What is what's your crystal ball say? What do we need to be preparing for?
Well, the kind of depressing story is that we saw house prices go through the roof. The Fed has taken actions by raising interest rates to control house prices, which I actually think was important because they were unsustainable at the level they were going, and they were being supported by low interest rates. But problem is that they've stopped house prices from growing. But I don't think the market conditions are such that we're going to see substantial fall in prices. I think we don't see the level of distress like we saw in 2008 forcing people to sell. So I think we're going to have to live with kind of high prices, and now we have higher interest rates. So the hurdles to get in for the next couple of years are going to be higher, which is going to make it harder to make progress in a lot of these areas. The good news, I would say, is that I do think there's more attention to this issue. And even though they haven't passed yet, the fact that we had Maxine Waters' proposal, the fact that we have the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, both of them did have bipartisan support. So I think there's a recognition that this is an important problem to solve, that there is a role for policy, and that hopefully to keep working on that. This Congress will be tough with the Republicans in the House not wanting to spend anything, but over the near term, I think we might see some more of these kind of financial supports to go towards this. So I'm ever hopeful, but we do face some headwinds in the market. And I guess the other key part of the equation too is this question about how much supply of housing we're providing, and it does seem like we've been not building enough housing. And if you really break it down, we're not building enough single family housing more than anything. And so we got to make sure that on the supply side, we're building homes and building entry level homes, not just 2,500 square foot McMansions.
Right. Yeah. And we could have an entire conversation about how to do that. Maybe we should do that. I think the supply thing is such a big deal.
Yeah.
And it's not just also, it's also, like, to your point, is part of that new supply entry level homes. Right. But anyway, well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and sharing your knowledge. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we'll repeat this broadcast more than once. And then maybe we could have an opportunity to have further this discussion someday, Chris.
I'd be happy to, Mike. It's great talking with you. This is important issues, and I appreciate your work in this area as well. So
great. Well, thank you.